On September 3rd, 1783, the United States of America was recognized as a free and independent country. After 8 long years, the Americans won their war for independence from Great Britain. Now, it needed to govern itself. Over the next 30 years, the young nation's first presidents and ministers would involve themselves in creating the policies, ideas, and divides that would shape the country into what it is today. Part 1. The Confederation Period. After the US won its independence, Americans had to figure out what kind of government they wanted, who could vote, and who could run for office. These were the primary questions that would shape the country in the 1780s. Everyone who agreed to independence also agreed that the new government should be a republic, which meant no king or nobles would be able to hold power like in Britain or France. The people would be in charge. But there was a disagreement about how this republic should work. Some, like the rich upper class, thought it should be led by the rich and educated such as themselves, while others wanted it to be more democratic. The elites, who had experience in the Continental Congress or the military, wanted a government like Britain's, which had a 2-house legislature and a strong leader who led it. They liked the idea of a strong central government with checks and balances, run by a few wealthy leaders. On the other hand, the more democratic-minded people, often from humble backgrounds and who had fought in the war, wanted more power for the people and the states. They pushed for a decentralized government with fewer voting restrictions and more frequent elections. During the war, the American colonies began setting up their own governments. They wrote state constitutions to replace the old British system. These new governments were a blend of ideas from both the elites and the Democrats. Some states, like Pennsylvania, went for more democratic setups. In 1776, Pennsylvania decided not to have a governor at all, and instead put power in the hands of a council of 12 people. Other states, like Massachusetts, were more careful and stuck with their colonial charter until 1780, when a new constitution was finally approved, albeit after much deliberation. At the national level, there were similar debates about how to run the new country. In June 1776, while the Declaration of Independence was being discussed in the Second Continental Congress, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia suggested setting up a plan for how the country should be governed. A committee was created to draft the Articles of Confederation, which aimed to create a strong central government. However, after much debate and compromise, the final version in 1777 created a weak federal government, leaving most power with the states. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, used from 1781 to 1789, reflected the democratic desire for a loose union of states. But its problems became clear very quickly, especially when it came to money. Congress could not raise taxes or handle the debt from the war, leading to economic trouble and growing frustration. Without the power to tax, Congress had to rely on printing paper money and getting loans from European countries and wealthy Americans. This led to inflation and a worthless currency. States, also struggling with debt, placed heavy taxes on their citizens, hurting poorer people. One state in particular was Massachusetts. In 1780, Massachusetts owed £11 million, and they had to repay it by 1785. The government couldn't meet the deadline and pushed it back to 1788. But when wealthy lawmakers from the eastern counties took control alongside the new constitution, they canceled the delay. to pay the debt, they raised taxes and demanded payment in physical forms of money, like coins. Between 1780 and 1786, Massachusetts collected £1.9 million sterling in taxes, but the tax system was unfair. Even poor men without land had to pay a poll tax of over £1 sterling, which made up a third of the state's income. This hit struggling farmers the hardest. By 1786, many states saw protests in rural areas. 7 states printed paper money or gave debtors more time to pay. But Massachusetts Governor James Bowdoin doubled down on his policies. As a result, lawsuits against debtors rose quickly. Between 1784 and 1786, a third of the men in Hampshire County were sued for their debt, and over 3,000 debt cases went to court. In Worcester County, 92 out of the 103 men in jail were there because of unpaid debts. People who could not pay risked losing their land or going to jail. Farmers in central and western Massachusetts, many of whom had fought in the Revolutionary War, grew angry. They believed that when the government did not listen, they had an obligation to stand up for their rights. These debtors began meeting, and when their pleas were ignored, they took action. In the summer of 1786, they shut down the courts. They knew that if the courts did not work, they could not be punished for their debts. To them, this was the only way to protect their land and freedom. In September, tensions boiled over. A war veteran named Daniel Shays and his followers closed down courts in Springfield. Bowdoin responded by raising an army of over 4,000 men led by General Benjamin Lincoln. On January 25, 1787, Shays led 700 rebels to take the state armory in Springfield, but the militia fired on them, killing 4 and scattering the rest. Over the next few months, Lincoln's army fought the rebels, and the rebellion eventually ended. Though the rebellion failed, it led to political change. The following year, voters chose the wealthy John Hancock as governor. Hancock supported debt relief and pardoned most of the rebels. Part 2. We the People. Shays' rebellion made the elites nervous. They thought the states were getting too democratic and wanted a stronger central government to take control. Congress had to act. Since 1775, the Continental Congress had been running things as the national government. But after the war ended in 1783, the states didn't feel like they needed Congress anymore. Congress was powerless to fix anything, thanks to the Articles of Confederation, and it was clear that the national government wasn't working. The origins of the U.S. Constitution started with a disagreement between Virginia and Maryland over the Potomac River. In 1784, James Madison, a member of the Virginia Assembly, suggested that both states send representatives to settle the issue. They fixed their issues, and also started to talk about how the two states could cooperate on trade and finances. Madison saw this and proposed a national convention to discuss trade regulations. The 1786 Annapolis Convention united those who wanted constitutional reform. This eventually led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they aimed to replace the Articles of Confederation with the U.S. Constitution. The Constitutional Convention was supposed to start on May 17th in Philadelphia, but only delegates from Pennsylvania and Virginia showed up on time. Virginia's group included George Washington, the famous leader of the Revolutionary War, and James Madison, who was already working on fixing problems with the government. Things got moving on May 29th, when Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph introduced the Virginia Plan, which Madison mostly wrote. This plan called for a stronger national government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It also gave the national government power to overrule state laws and taxes. The delegates agreed on having a single president with veto power, despite Madison wanting more shared power. A big debate arose about how to count enslaved people for representation in Congress. At that time, enslaved African Americans made up about 1/3 of the population. Northern states worried that counting them fully would give the southern states, where slavery was most common, too much power. The compromise was to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for both taxes and representation. This disagreement was an early sign of the divisions that would later tear the country apart. There was also a fight between big and small states over how representation should work. Large states wanted representation based on population, while smaller states feared losing their voice. On June 14th, New Jersey's William Peterson proposed the New Jersey Plan, which called for a single House legislature where each state had 1 vote. The delegates rejected it on June 19th, with only 3 states supporting it. In early July, Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed the Great Compromise. The lower house would have representation based on population, while the upper house would give each state an equal vote. By late August and early September, the delegates turned to the presidency. They debated how long the president should serve and how they should be elected. They settled on a 4-year term with no limit on re-election. Instead of Congress or the public directly electing the president, they created the Electoral College. The people would vote for electors, who would then vote for the president. After the Constitutional Convention finished drafting the Constitution in September, they sent it to Congress in New York, and from there, it went to the states for approval. All 13 states had to agree to replace the Articles of Confederation, but the changes were so big that the delegates knew not everyone was on board. The supporters of the Constitution, mostly wealthy elites, called themselves Federalists. They cleverly labeled their opponents, the Democrats, as anti-Federalists. This made the Federalists seem like defenders of the country, while anti-Federalists looked like they were against progress. It was a smart use of propaganda to sway public opinion. The anti-Federalists were worried that a strong central government would take power from the states and threaten people's rights. They wanted a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms. In response, 3 Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote 85 essays, known as the Federalist Papers, to convince people that the Constitution wasn't as dangerous as the anti-Federalists said it was. Delaware became the first state to approve the Constitution on December 7, 1787. By the end of the year, 4 more states followed. In states like Massachusetts, Federalists promised to consider adding a Bill of Rights, which helped them gain support. This approach worked in other states too, as many anti-Federalists agreed to back the Constitution if a Bill of Rights was added later. By June 21, 1788, 11 states had ratified the Constitution. In 1789, the Judiciary Act and the promised Bill of Rights were added. The Judiciary Act set up the court system, including the Supreme Court, and gave federal courts the power to handle cases about the Constitution and federal laws. The Bill of Rights guaranteed key freedoms like free speech, religion, a right to a fair trial, and protection from government abuse, all of which Americans still value today. The addition of a Bill of Rights also convinced North Carolina and Rhode Island, the last two holdouts, to join the Union. Part 3: Washington and the Federalist Period. George Washington became the first U.S. president on April 30, 1789. His election was no surprise since he was very popular. He got all 69 electoral votes, while John Adams became vice president. Washington chose Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, and John Jay as Chief Justice. Hamilton, born in the West Indies, came from a modest background but quickly rose in politics. He supported a strong central government and had ambitious plans to grow the economy. In 1790, he presented his Report on Public Credit to Congress, pushing to make sure the U.S. paid its debts. He also suggested the federal government take over state debts from the Revolutionary War. The southern states, which had already paid off their debts, didn't like this idea and blocked the plan. They eventually reached a deal. Hamilton's plan would pass, and the new capital would be built in the South, later becoming Washington, D.C. In 1791, Hamilton pushed for the U.S. to build its own industries with his Report on Manufactures. He wanted the country to rely less on farming and foreign trade. To help new industries, he proposed tariffs and government support. His ideas shaped the nation's economy and strengthened the central government. However, many worried that this gave too much power to the wealthy, who stood to gain if the economy did well. The main opposition to Hamilton's policies came from Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a wealthy landowner, slaveholder, and former governor of Virginia, was worried about Hamilton's push for a manufacturing-based economy. From what he saw in Europe, Jefferson believed that manufacturing depended on a large group of poor, landless workers. He felt the U.S. should focus on farming as long as possible, because pushing for manufacturing will lead to more inequality and take away personal freedom. In his 1785 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson compares Europe's economy to America's. In Europe, the lands are either cultivated or locked up against the cultivator, wrote Jefferson. Manufacture must therefore be resorted to of necessity, not of choice, to support the surplus of their people. But we have an immensity of land courting the industry of the husbandman. Is it best, then, that all our citizens should be employed in its improvement, or that one half should be called off from that to exercise manufactures and handicraft arts for the other? This disagreement between Jefferson and Hamilton eventually led to the creation of the first political parties in America. Hamilton supported a strong central government that promoted manufacturing, while Jefferson wanted a country of small, independent farmers. This divide led to the formation of the Federalist Party, backing Hamilton, and the Democratic-Republican Party, supporting Jefferson and Madison. In 1794, the idea of a strong central government faced its first big challenge. Hamilton, aiming to help pay off the national debt, introduced a tax on whiskey. This hit farmers, especially those in places like western Pennsylvania, hard. These farmers couldn't easily transport their grain over rough terrain, like the Appalachian Mountains, so they turned it into whiskey, which was easier to move and sell. When the whiskey tax passed, they felt it was unfair because whiskey was their main source of income. protests erupted almost immediately. At first, Washington and Hamilton didn't act, but by the summer of 1794, things got out of control when 6,000 protesters gathered near Pittsburgh, threatening rebellion. Washington sent 12,000 troops and the rebels backed down. However, these farmers weren't suffering as much as they believed. Between 1790 and 1796, over 80% of the national budget was spent on fighting indigenous tribes in the western frontier. Since the 1750s, white settlers had been moving into native lands, sparking conflict with tribes like the Delaware, Shawnee, and Ottawa, who formed the Northwestern Confederacy. The British, despite giving up control of the area to the US, still had forts in the area and supported the tribes. Throughout the 1780s, the Northwestern Confederacy raided white settlements, and settlers retaliated with their own violent attacks. In 1791, a U.S. army led by Arthur St. Clair was ambushed and defeated at the Battle of the Wabash. In response, the government sent General Anthony Wayne in 1794. He won a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, forcing the tribes to agree to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This treaty forced the Northwestern Confederacy to sell a large part of what is now Ohio to the U.S. With the suppression of both the Whiskey Rebellion and the defeat of the indigenous tribes, the federal government showed it had the power to enforce its laws and maintain order. After George Washington became president in 1789, the French Revolution began. Many Americans were excited, as they just had their own revolution. But in 1793, when France executed King Louis XVI and the Reign of Terror started, American views changed. Federalists, who supported Britain, were upset by the violence, while Republicans still supported France, seeing it as another fellow republic. Tensions rose with the Jay Treaty of 1794. Washington sent John Jay to negotiate with Britain to avoid war. The treaty had Britain leave its force in the northwestern U.S. and allowed some trade, but it restricted U.S. trade with French colonies. While it improved relations with Britain, the treaty was unpopular with the public and the Republicans, who thought it favored Britain too much. By 1796, Washington was tired of public life. He had only agreed to a second term in 1792 to try and stop political parties from forming, but the Jay Treaty showed that goal was impossible. Washington decided not to run for a third term in 1796 and planned to leave politics completely. With help from Hamilton and John Jay, Washington wrote a farewell letter. He warned against political parties and urged the U.S. to stay out of European conflicts. Though he was still respected, many ignored his advice after he died in 1799. With George Washington not running for a third term, the first real contest between the Federalists and the Republicans began. The Federalists backed Adams, Washington's vice president, while the Republicans supported Jefferson. Hamilton, though a Federalist, didn't like Adams and tried to manipulate the election in favor of Thomas Pinckney, Adams' running mate. The plan failed, and Adams barely won the election of 1796, beating Jefferson by 3 electoral votes, with Pinckney finishing in third. Meanwhile, tensions with France were rising. The French were angry about the Jay Treaty, thinking it threatened their interests. When Adams won, France started to attack American ships. Adams sent diplomats to negotiate, but the French foreign minister demanded a bribe, sparking what became known as the XYZ affair. This outraged Americans and many wanted to go to war with France. Congress increased funding for the Army and Navy, but Adams avoided an official declaration of war, leading to an unofficial naval conflict called the Quasi-War. At home, in 1798, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and punished anyone who spoke against the government. Jefferson and Madison responded by writing the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions, which argued that states could reject federal laws they believed were unconstitutional. While most states didn't support this, the idea of states' rights was born. The election of 1800 was a bitter rematch between Jefferson and Adams. The Federalists accused Jefferson of being too radical, while the Republicans called Adams a tyrant. In the end, Jefferson and Adams tied with 73 electoral votes, and the decision went to the House of Representatives. After 35 votes, Jefferson finally won. The Federalists would never hold the presidency again. Part 4. The Empire of Liberty. As mentioned before, Thomas Jefferson believed that a strong, healthy U.S. should be made up of small, independent farmers. To support this vision, he needed more land and ways for farmers to sell their crops, so he looked west. When Napoleon Bonaparte took control of France in 1799, he wanted to rebuild French power in the Americas. But after a slave rebellion in Haiti, money issues from wars in Europe, and the threat of war with Britain, Napoleon decided to sell the huge Louisiana Territory. In 1803, the U.S. bought the land from France for $15 million. The territory of 828,000 square miles of land that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, giving the U.S. control of the Mississippi and opening up vast tracts of land for farming. Jefferson saw the Mississippi River and New Orleans as the key route for sending American crops to the world. However, the Louisiana Purchase had serious consequences for the 150,000 indigenous peoples living on the land. Settlers began moving into the land, pushing Native Americans out, leading to further conflicts that lasted for decades. In 1803, after the U.S. agreed to buy Louisiana, France and Britain went back to war. The U.S. stayed neutral, trading with both sides and making a lot of money. However, trading during the war was risky, especially with Britain's powerful navy controlling the seas. American merchants thrived. By 1810, U.S. ships were moving nearly 3 times more goods than in 1790. Their ships traveled all over the world, from China to the Mediterranean. Despite the boom in trade, the U.S. lacked the military power to fully protect this trade. The Republicans were careful about spending on the military because they worried large armies could threaten citizens' freedoms. Jefferson was hesitant to strengthen the Navy, knowing it couldn't match Britain's powerful fleet. This weakness was exposed when pirates from North Africa attacked American ships. The U.S. paid these pirates around $100,000 each year to avoid attacks, but when the payments fell behind in 1801, the pirates seized American ships again. The U.S. responded by sending its navy to blockade the city of Tripoli from 1801 to 1805. After failed rescue attempts, the U.S. ended up paying $60,000 to restore peace. The Tripolitan War made it clear that America needed a stronger navy to protect its trade. However, by 1807, Jefferson's defense plan still relied more on coastal defenses and small gunboats rather than a strong navy. This left the US vulnerable, and soon both Britain and France would test America's ability to protect its trade. As a neutral country, the US wanted to keep free trade open to everyone, but Britain, protecting its own interests, tried to stop American trade with France. They used an old rule from 1756, saying trade that wasn't allowed during peacetime couldn't start up again during war. Because of this, the British Navy began seizing American ships headed to and from France. In 1805, a British court said that American re-exports of British goods broke their trade laws, leading to even more ship seizures. France also seized ships, claiming similar reasons. Trade wasn't the only issue. After the War of Independence, many British sailors joined the American merchant fleets and navy. By the early 1800s, about a quarter of American sailors were British. Some were US citizens, while others had deserted for better pay and working conditions. Along with seizing ships, the British started stopping American ships to press suspected deserters back into the Royal Navy. In the process, they often took American-born sailors too. This situation became worse in 1807 when the British ship HMS Leopard attacked the US Navy's Chesapeake. The British were supposedly searching for deserters, but when the Chesapeake's captain hesitated, the Leopard fired, killing 3 Americans and injuring 21. This angered many Americans, and calls for war grew louder. Jefferson didn't want to go to war or expend the Navy to do so. Instead, he chose diplomacy and economic pressure. In December, Congress passed the Embargo Act, halting all US trade until Britain and France respected America's rights to trade with both. But the embargo backfired, severely damaging the US economy. Exports dropped sharply, from $108 million of value in 1807 to just $22 million in 1808. Southern and Western farmers, who were key supporters of Jefferson, were hit the hardest. In 1808, James Madison and the Republicans won the presidency, but soon after, Congress repealed the Embargo Act in March 1809. Lifting the embargo did nothing to help. By 1811, tensions between the US and Britain were still high, mainly due to the British still impressing American sailors. To protect its ships, the US sent the USS President to patrol the Atlantic. On May 16th, the President encountered the British ship the HMS Little Belt, and they exchanged gunfire. The President killed 9 British sailors and injured more. Americans saw this as payback for the previous attack on the Chesapeake, but the British were furious and also called for war. At the same time, out west, indigenous tribes were rallying to fight back against American settlers. Shawnee leaders Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa tried to form a confederation to stop American expansion into Indiana. Even though Governor William Henry Harrison defeated them at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, they didn't give up. Many Americans wrongly thought the British were helping the Native Americans, which fueled even more talk of war with Britain, and some even wanted to take over Canada. This unrest led to a more aggressive attitude in Congress. A new group called the War Hawks, led by figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, wanted a tougher approach with the British. They were part of a younger generation pushing for a more powerful and expanding America. With these war hawks stirring the pot, it was only inevitable that Britain and America would go to war.